Hello, AP World History class. It's so nice to see you again. Oh, wait, I can't see you. You can see me. I'm at home. I'm actually sitting in a room where I actually can see the sunlight. It's kind of nice. Today I'm going to be talking very, very rapidly, so please pause if you need to, but I want to get through this in just part 2. I don't want to have a part 3. Latin America. Remember, they've gotten rid of the peninsulares, but they have weak constitutional republics. They want to have some of the ideas of the Constitution of the Enlightenment that they see in the United States and in parts of Europe, but they just don't know how to do it. They don't have experience with self-rule like the U.S. did. And they continue, like the U.S. did, and Canada, to have problems and issues as they started to take over the land with indigenous peoples. And for the most part, the indigenous peoples were assimilated or marginalized. This is providing, of course, that they had survived the terrible illnesses that were brought to Latin America by the Europeans. So in the end, less than 5% of the male population was active in public affairs. And so if you include females in there, that would say only about 2.5% of the people were active in public affairs. This would lead to a rise of military leaders. These are local people who are popular with the masses. So from 1835 to 1852, these caudillos became very popular. Now, Rosa is an example of one in Argentina, and you can read more about them in your book. But oftentimes, what happens, and what we'll see later on in history too, and what we even saw with Robespierre in the Reign of Terror, is that people will resort to really what would seem like barbaric and really gruesome means of gaining control by killing people, just killing people. But eventually this would restore order to Latin America. Mexico, just taking a look at Mexico as a special case after independence from the Spanish. There were a succession of governments. A monarchy was restored for a short period of time. A republic was created, but it was very ineffective. The caudillos came into power, but they were more concerned with military than they were with really ruling. And finally, we have reform that is going to be led by the indigenous president, Benito Juarez. Now, he called for the following reforms. Universal male suffrage. Wow, that's like a huge accomplishment because this would include both the indigenous people as well as the Creoles. He called for freedom of speech. He wanted to control the military, the power of the elites, and the power of the church, who owned about half of the land in Mexico at the time. He additionally suspended loan payments to Europeans, and this would actually lead to the holiday that we now call Cinco de Mayo, which was a celebration of that suspension of loan payments to Europeans and victory in defeating Europeans who came into Mexico to try to get their loan payments back. But one of the things that he did do that ended up leading to his downfall was land reform. He broke up corporate properties, and he broke up communal Indian lands, and he tried to redistribute the land. And we're going to see later on in China and in other places, you know, oftentimes land redistribution problems just don't work out well in the long run, while they might seem like a good solution. So President Porfirio Diaz comes into power in 1876. Now, if you take a look at this picture, and if we had more time, I would spend time looking at this in class, but this is a political cartoon, and you can see the man in the front here. He has a ball and chain on his foot. This is peonage, debt peonage. We have the land barons. I can't see what this says on the strap here, but this picture is just full of symbolism and the abuses of President Porfirio Diaz. He ruled like a dictator. In fact, it says there, I guess I have kind of a double message there, dictator rules Mexico like a dictator. That's what he did. Mexico once again went back to control by the elites who owned 95% of the land. So that's leaving 5% of the land for everyone else. The lower class leaders then once again are drawn to revolutionary leaders like Emilio Zapata and Pancho Villa, who end up being heroes. Like when I was in Mexico, I think it was in about 12 years ago, I got a Pancho Villa string puppet doll, and I was going to show it to you all, but you know, I can't find it, and we need to keep going. But at any rate, these become very, very much heroes to the people of Mexico because they represent them. Okay, they're not the lower class people, but they represent the ordinary person. However, the problem with these guys is they actually were pretty brutal. In fact, Pancho Villa is said to, there's a video I saw of him, and it said he killed his enemies, he killed his friends, he killed everyone just because he liked it. He really was a pretty brutal man. But nevertheless, they did, the peasants, the workers, and the middle class did like these revolutionaries and could relate to them, unlike Dictator Diaz. So they confiscated and redistributed lands from the elite. In other words, that sounds pretty easy, but actually what it means is they went into and onto the plantations of the people that owned the land, the very rich people. They killed them and they said, okay, now we can redistribute these lands. They both were eventually killed, Zapata in 1919 and Pancho Villa in 1923. The rebels overall were defeated, even though they were very popular. But eventually this would lead to the new constitution in Mexico of 1917, which included universal suffrage, land redistribution, public education, and minimum wages. So Mexico kind of went through a long process of elite rule versus these popular heroes, etc. Now let's talk very quickly about economic development in the USA, Canada, and Latin America, because they all are a little bit different, so please take note of the differences. The British continue to invest capital into the United States. Even though the U.S. had broken off from the British realized that from an economic point of view, it was a good idea to stay close to the USA. And they had a lot of ties, and they had friendships, and they had families. Industrialization is going to expand. Electrification, in other words, putting electrical wires up, connecting cities, the development of trade unions, increasing productivity while increasing and bettering the lives of the people who are working in industry. The rail system expands tremendously from this time. We go from 1860 having about 20,000 miles of rail to about 200,000 miles of rail by the time of the turn of the century. Was a pretty big deal. Trusts and cartels developed, and these were not necessarily a good thing. And so in 1890, antitrust laws went into effect, but were not enforced until the early 1900s. We also have huge numbers, thousands and thousands of Asians and Europeans pouring into the USA, providing inexpensive labor and really building the economy of the United States. Canada enacts the National Policy, which is an economic development program, and we can thank Prime Minister MacDonald for that. And an important piece of this was the Canadian Pacific Railroad, as I mentioned before, very much like the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and this opened up Western lands to development. It brought new territories, and you can see in the map here the territories that currently exist in Canada. I always have really been kind of curious what none of it looks like. What a great name for a territory. Where do you live? I live in none of it. Okay, I put this picture down here, by the way. This is a picture of the Soo Line Railroad Company, which was bought by the Canadian Pacific Railroad, and which was the company that my dad worked for while I was growing up, and CP Rail gave him a really nice retirement package. Just thought you might like to know that. Anyways, the U.S. and Canadian economy become so intertwined, and the U.S. in fact owned 30% of Canadian industry. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, I have a lot of Canadian family. They don't really like that these economies are so intertwined. They really want to be considered on their own merit, and Canada has had some very successful industry, but nevertheless is very dependent still on U.S. investment. In Latin America, the Europeans invest in an export market, but not in infrastructure. Industrialization is stalled in most areas, and in fact what people in Latin America have to deal with is the foreign investor control. The people are subject to foreign interests. In other words, they don't really have their own control in decision making, and in fact Latin America provides a lot of raw materials to Europe and to the United States and to Canada, but they don't develop that infrastructure, they don't really industrialize, and really they are subject to foreign interests. And we see this will continue to be a problem in Latin America, and one of the things that some of the areas of Latin America have improved on in recent years. Social and cultural diversity in the USA, we begin to see the rise of the women's rights. The Seneca Falls Convention, as you may recall, I talked about women's rights and the attention to that coming alongside of the abolition movement. And so 1848, the abolition movement is in full swing, as is the women's rights movement. They're trying to get past this 19th century idea of the cult of domesticity, that the role of the woman was to be at home. The U.S. at this time becomes the most culturally diverse population in the hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. Because we have all of these immigrants from Asia and Europe, as well as the indigenous population, and this would bring with it its own share of problems. Now, the indigenous people, there was forced assimilation that occurred here. I really, really hope you learn about the boarding school movement if you haven't already. This was a very, very egregious attempt, I think, to try to, the motto was, save the child, kill the Indian. And so the Indians were sent to these boarding schools. They were basically kidnapped from, or taken forcibly from their tribal lands, brought to these boarding schools where their hair was cut. They were forbidden to speak their tribal language. And the idea here was that we need to assimilate the Indians. Again, hopefully that is something that you will talk more about in American history, as well as the discrimination against the freed slaves. So we have immigrants, we have indigenous people, and we have freed slaves, who are also immigrants, but by forced immigration. Canada, likewise, has its share of social diversity. We have the Anglophones, who are the English-speaking people, and the Francophones, the French-speaking people. And in fact, the official languages of Canada are both French and English, and Canadian students take both French and English in their school. There is a complex social structure that develops based on race in Canada. And as I mentioned yesterday, the Metis, the mixed-race people of French and Indigenous origin, the Inuits, and the First Nations people are all part of that social structure, with the First Nations people being on the bottom to this day. In Latin America, we have Europeans, natives, indigenous people, African slaves, and mestizos, mixed-race peoples. But what really becomes popular in Latin America is the gaucho, the cowboy. This becomes a glorified symbol of the rural culture, and the gauchos, in essence, were, it could be of any race, potentially. It was just this image, this cowboy image that just people could identify with, the ordinary person. Now, I want to just talk very quickly about the big picture. Territorial expansion, all three of these areas, Latin America, US, and Canada, all come into conflict with indigenous people. Indigenous people are either marginalized in society, they're assimilated in society, or they're killed, either through disease or through outright war. Now, many of them were given lands in Canada and the United States, but oftentimes the conditions there were very, very poor and continue to be so. They all three struggled with constitutions. The U.S. was more successful after the Civil War because they had more experience, like I said before. Canada, again, working alongside Britain, had developed a constitutional republic without war. Latin America, continuing inequality between Creoles, peasants, and military dictatorships, and this would be a theme throughout the period that we're talking about. And economic development, the final piece of the picture, foreign investment, cheap labor in both U.S. and Canada allow U.S. and Canada to thrive. The economies in the United States and Canada were built upon foreign investment and the access to labor. There's no question about it. In Latin America, I'm going to introduce a new term, economic colonialism. In fact, you should underline or highlight this term because economic colonialism is something that we're going to see continues into the 20th century. Latin America continues to provide raw materials for the industrialized nations in U.S. and Canada and Europe. The elites are going to profit, and the peasants are going to suffer. So thank you for listening to my very, very fast, very a brief overview of Chapter 30. Please be ready with your IDs and be ready to take the quiz tomorrow. And don't forget about the Fensom Elevator Company. My father-in-law was pretty excited this morning to hear that I told you guys about that. All right, have a great day, and I will see you on Monday.